The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 1 vote against.
It was the first veto cast by the United States in the UN Security Council in almost 7 years. Donald Trump wants Jerusalem recognized as Israel's capital and says he'll move the American embassy there. But on the Security Council, only the US agrees.
The United States will not be told by any country where we can put our embassy. Buried even deeper in the jargon of this resolution is the accusation that the United States is setting back the prospects of peace in the Middle East. That is a scandalous charge. What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten.
Hours later, the US made another threat.
For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us.
And he's not exaggerating. According to the US government agency, US aid helps a lot of countries around the world, handing out $49 billion in economic funding last year alone. But the threat of this money being taken away doesn't seem to have changed many minds.
We always unansweringly support and promote the Middle East peace process, back the Palestinians and their righteous cause of resuming their legitimate national interests. This position will never change.
The world has changed. The notion of I am powerful, therefore I am right has changed. Now the world is rising against the unfair. From now on, no honorable nation, no honorable state will bow to such pressure.
This is really new definition of world order in politics, and it seems that the American administration, they are putting their stamp on a new political reality.
As politicians argue, Palestinians clash with Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank, a daily occurrence since Trump first recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital on December the 6th. Many people are now wondering whether the UN is capable of convincing the US president to change his mind for the sake of peace. Although for now, that seems highly unlikely.
Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot. We don't care.
Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He's a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Israel. Also in Washington is Wael Al-Zayed, who's advised the U.S. delegation at the UN under President Obama. He's now the CEO of Mgage USA. And from London, we have Jeffrey Alderman. He's a professor of Jewish history and politics at the University of Buckingham. Gentlemen, welcome. Ambassador Pickering, first to you. As a man who's seen the inner workings of the United Nations firsthand, what impact will today's vote at the General Assembly have?
Kamali, thank you. Not good, certainly. The use of pressure of this kind to induce a vote has its own consequences in terms of how and in what way people will look at that in terms of their total relationship with the United States, and a country which is unfortunately losing popularity internationally as we watch is not going to increase that, and as a result, its overall influence by these kinds of threats. There are even stories here in Washington that the Democrats will try to block any effort to do this in the Congress. I'm not sure that will work, but in the past, Secretary Baker, at the time of the passage of the use of force resolution back in 1990, told Yemen they would lose their assistance if Yemen indeed voted against that resolution. Yemen did. They lost their assistance over time. That was repaired. This is a general threat and obviously can have general negative consequences.
Jeffrey Alderman, in London, are you concerned that there seems to be an even further growing antithesis to the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital after Donald Trump's announcement just a couple of weeks ago?
No, I'm not concerned. In fact, last April, President Putin of Russia announced that Russia was recognizing East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state and West Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state. No one made a great fuss over that. So am I concerned? No, I'm not really concerned. I understand that the Czech Republic has announced that it now recognizes West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is simply recognizing facts on the ground, isn't it?
Perhaps. Well, Anxiety in Washington for us. So we've heard from Ambassador Pickering saying that this is going to have a negative impact. There's no concern from the backers of this decision. So what use is the United Nations in this particular instance in having this vote?
I think right now the use really is mainly symbolic, demonstrating the international community's concern regarding the, quite frankly, the walking away of the United States of its position in terms of supporting a political settlement to the question of Jerusalem. But beyond that, really, as somebody who has covered the Middle East for 10 years, I'm afraid that neither this posturing on the part of the OIC and the UN in general is going to lead to an actual improvement on the situation on the ground, nor will these threats by the administration, quite frankly, to blackmail countries, perhaps poor countries, will really either help the Palestinians and the Israelis achieve the peace they desire, nor certainly help our bilateral relationships with important countries in important parts of the world. I mean,
symbolism is one thing, isn't it, Wael? Because where the United Nations was set up to be a sort of a beacon of hope for the world after the Second World War, it also was meant to do things. And yet it keeps being outmaneuvered at every turn recently.
It is something that had begun long before this confrontation here. Again, I worked on Syria, for example, for a number of years, and I saw painfully how the Russians and the Chinese, but particularly the Russians, undermined the very reason the Security Council is in existence. And we all know the United States, in its steadfast support for Israel, has also wielded its influence and obviously the veto on numerous occasions to at times halt any meaningful progress. So it definitely undermines the institution of the Security Council and the General Assembly writ large when the body is just seen as a place where the elite get together, complain about one another's country, and then go home.
Jeffrey Alderman, there are many resolutions levelled against Israel. They're probably weekly at certain times, and they come to a head every now and again. Is the Israeli leadership at all concerned about the position they find themselves in now in 2017, or do they think they can just work around the auspices of the United Nations?
Oh, I don't think they're concerned at all. There has never been what is known as a Chapter 7 resolution against Israel in the United Nations. Now, a Chapter 7 resolution would be mandatory, and that would be a serious state of affairs.
But isn't that because of the vetoes being used by the United States?
Exactly, that's what I was about to say, exactly. So they have got the sort of American president that they want. He is playing to a domestic Christian evangelical audience as much as to an international audience. And are the Israelis concerned about the UN? Absolutely not. And so far as the so-called peace process is concerned, insofar as there is a peace process of any sort, where are the Palestinians going to go? Are they going to go to Russia? I don't think so. Are they going to go to China? Well, the economic relationship between China and Israel is closer than it's ever been. This past week, we learned that the first Israeli university to set up a campus in Israel, that plan is going ahead. So that the Palestinians have run out of options.
Ambassador Pickering, can you pick up on some of that? Do you think it is now probably time for the Palestinians perhaps to try and work outside of the United Nations? I mean, there's been a peace of some sorts or some kind of resolution perhaps being brought to the war in Syria by the Astana talks, led, of course, by Russia, Iran and Turkey.
Look, the real issue here is the one that we have only lightly mentioned upon. That's the question of whether there can be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And the decision to, quote, recognize Jerusalem, something quite strange in international law, is clearly a part of how or in what way the U.S. can be an important influence in that direction. It's a great influence in the president's own popularity and obviously in his role here in domestic politics. It had nothing to do with the fact that for over 50 years, the parties and the mediators have carefully avoided jumping to conclusions on Jerusalem in a way that would block the role of Israel and the Palestinians to reach a solution. With respect to Israel and the United Nations, I spent some time in Israel. There's a small expression in Hebrew called shmum, which generally means let's ignore the UN. On the other hand, it's quite clear that both the United States and Israel are working hard to do what they can with General Assembly membership to keep the vote today from being a kind of 180 to a few disaster for the Israelis in terms of international popularity. It has more small influence in the General Assembly here, a little more in the Security Council, but I think that in the end, none of this seems to be moving forward in the very difficult situation which both Israelis and Palestinians face should they really want a peace settlement, and that's open to some question now. But the Palestinians in particular are divided still between Hamas and al-Fatah. Until they get together, there isn't any kind of unified Palestinian approach to this problem. All of this looks like we're on the dead-end road to further difficulty, if not worse, and that's been a considerable problem. Over the years, we have thought things couldn't get any worse, and they have shown, put it this way, an unfettered capacity to do that. One worries about conflict in the region, and one worries certainly about the unsettled problems, but under the current circumstances, it is extremely difficult, in my view, to be optimistic or hopeful about any of this leading anywhere positive.
Well, Al-Zayat, I'll get you to pick up on that. Sorry for that one. But do you think that there is a chance, as Ambassador Haley has said in recent times, to move the ball forward by Trump's decision to do this, you know, sort of be a disruptor in the region, and by making this move, he's going to get people to come to some kind of negotiating table?
I would like to be an optimist here, but that's going to be really difficult. As the good ambassador said, really, and the previous guest, a lot of this had to do with domestic political consumption for the president and his steadfast evangelical base, including his own vice president. I do think that, you know, if you really want to stretch the possibilities here, this could galvanize the Palestinians and the rest of the international community to work outside the UN and or even beyond just trying to look at the United States for leadership on this issue. But really, this is going to have more to do with economic development, with social justice on the ground, with helping the Palestinians reform their institutions. I mean, just right now, we have an unprecedented attack on Palestinian minors right now who are being detained in Israeli jails. Those are issues that I think the Criminal Court of Justice and other international bodies can take a look at right now in a way to kind of add different kind of pressure on the Israelis and this administration to really do what's right on the ground and potentially open up the avenue for future possibilities. But in terms of leadership from this administration on this issue in a tangible way, I do not see it.
Jeffrey Alderman, can you see a way that the government in Israel could be perhaps brought to a negotiating table by members of the United Nations by this pressure, any way at all?
No, none whatsoever. One of your guests a moment or so ago mentioned the Israeli phrase shmum, and this was invented by the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who said that what's important is not what the outside world thinks, it's what the Jews and the Jewish state does. The United Nations has no role whatsoever to play in any so-called peace negotiations. On the wider issue, I'm afraid I'm a pessimist here. I don't think in the foreseeable future we're talking about anything remotely resembling conflict resolution. The very most we can hope for is conflict management, by which I mean there'll be flare-ups, there'll be riots, there'll be some killings, and then the issue will die down again and then it will flare up again. That's the most we can hope for.
Ambassador Pickering, Jeffrey Alderman says he's a pessimist. While try to be an optimist, where do you sit, and what role would the United Nations have in trying to dampen down what's happening in the region at the moment?
I think very limited, in all honesty. I don't disagree with the two colleagues who've been on this program with me in that regard. I think that one can look back at Resolution 242, which had certainly its reinterpreters before it became part of the international canon on this question. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be any inclination to go forward in that direction. The Obama administration looked at it at the end of the day. John Kerry made an interesting speech in which he laid out some principles, but that doesn't get to the problem of the leaders, their lack of interest in this particular question on both sides, and in some cases, their lack of capacity in their own domestic environment to try to produce the negotiations, much less the hard decisions that have to be made. I think that it is not sufficient merely to strengthen the Palestinians. They haven't been told that they have an economic test or a social test to pass before they can participate in negotiations, despite the fact that that seems to be, at the moment, the best alternative we have. I'm not against it, but I'm against noting the fact that they have to do this because, in fact, they're not yet qualified to negotiate a political settlement. I do think, however, that probably we're going to have to see some leadership evolution, if I could put it that way, either among the people who are there, that seems close to impossible, or over time replacement before we can get to the heart of this particular question. I agree with Jeffrey that this is going to continue to be a nagging and messy and difficult problem in a region which is also fraught with a lot of other circumstances that are connected with this. But I don't agree, in fact, that over a period of time, there cannot be a solution to this problem. And in many ways, the inability to get a solution of this problem tempers the whole region. And as we look ahead in the longer term, would the U.S. come back in some way to be a more important player? Could it help to mobilize the others, perhaps the quartet, which is moribund now? Could it play a role with the UN? That's possible. But these are all very thin threads to hang on to in a fabric that is fraying very badly.
Okay, Jeffrey Alderman, let me just get you to try and respond, please, to the words of the US Ambassador Nikki Haley and this threat to take names of those who vote against the resolution against the United States today. That's all stick, isn't it? That's not going to help in diplomacy or trying to bring a peaceful solution to the region.
Well, I believe what President Trump and his UN ambassador have said. I think it would not surprise me in the slightest that tomorrow, or even as early as this evening perhaps, the Trump administration would announce that one or two countries carefully picked out of all those well over 100 who will vote in effect against the UN at the Special General Assembly will find American aid cut off. Can I also mention that my contacts in Washington have told me that it is entirely possible that financial sanctions will be applied not merely to countries who vote against the USA today, but also against the UN itself. I think that's highly possible.
And well, pick up on that. What do you make of the reports that Jeffrey is mentioning there, that the sanctions will perhaps be wider, not just against those who voted against them, but against the institution of the UN itself?
I mean, certainly such a move, I think, would be almost unprecedented on the part of the United States, that we've done that before against Yemen, as it was mentioned. But that would be incredibly damaging, not only to our reputation, but potentially our bilateral relationship in parts of the world where we have security or political or otherwise interests. And really, I cannot think but that will also hurt our relationships with key allies, including the British and the French, who may look at this move as a very damaging one, and one that sends the wrong signal to the international community on what the United States will not do on this particular issue. This is not a U.S. national security issue. Okay. This is a support for an ally that we've had a relationship with for a very long time. But the United States is not under assault here, and for such a move to happen really would be an overreaction. But I do agree that given everything we know about this administration, it is quite possible.
So some agreement there at the end. Well, Al-Zayat, Jeffrey Alderman in London, and Ambassador Thomas Pickering also in Washington, thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen.